The winter sun hung low over the Montana prairie, casting long golden shadows across a sea of pristine white snow. 12 years had passed since the cruelest season of Eleanor Holden's life, that terrible winter of 1887, when she had been nothing more than a ghost haunting a frozen cabin. Today, as she stood by the expansive bay window of the sprawling ranch house she now called home, the howling wind outside sounded less like a threat and more like a defeated adversary. She pressed her hand against the thick, insulated glass. It was cold, but the chill could not reach her bones. Behind her, the massive stone hearth crackled and hissed, radiating a deep, penetrating heat that smelled of seasoned oak and sweet pine resin. The air in the parlor was thick with the comforting aromas of roasting cinnamon apples and freshly baked bread, a stark, beautiful contrast to the days when she had survived on a handful of hard, flavorless beans. Eleanor turned away from the window, a soft smile touching her lips as her gaze swept across the room. The house was alive. It possessed a heartbeat made of laughter, hurried footsteps, and the gentle murmur of a family that had been built from the ashes of profound grief. On the large woven rug near the fire, her youngest daughter, Sarah, was busily constructing a fortress out of wooden blocks. At 7 years old, Sarah was a hurricane of boundless energy and wild blonde curls, possessing a spirit that the prairie had not yet taught to be cautious. Beside her sat Clara, their eldest. At 11, Clara had inherited her father's deep, soulful brown eyes, the very same eyes that had looked at Eleanor with such gentle respect on a freezing Christmas Eve a lifetime ago. Clara was patiently helping her little sister balance a particularly stubborn block, her movements calm and measured. And then there was Thomas, 10 years old and already possessing a quiet, watchful resilience that mirrored Eleanor's own. He was currently sitting at the heavy oak dining table, his head bowed over a leather-bound ledger, clumsily practicing his numbers under the affectionate eye of old Pete. The weathered cowboy, whose joints were now too stiff for the hardest winter labor, had found a new purpose as a surrogate grandfather to the children, passing down the lore of the land with every carved wooden horse and patient arithmetic lesson. Eleanor's heart swelled until it physically ached with gratitude. She had not merely survived, she had flourished. The barren, terrifying expanse of her past had been entirely overwritten by this vibrant, chaotic, and unimaginably precious present. The heavy oak front door opened, letting in a brief, biting gust of winter air before it was quickly pushed shut. Samuel stepped into the entryway, stamping his snow-caked leather boots on the heavy mat. He pulled off his thick buffalo coat, his breath rising in a faint white mist that quickly vanished in the warmth of the house. Eleanor watched him, so her pulse giving that familiar steady flutter that 12 years of marriage had never managed to dull. At 52, Samuel Holden was a monument of a man. The streaks of gray that had once dusted his temples had now claimed the majority of his hair, turning it the color of polished silver. The lines around his eyes and mouth had deepened, carved by harsh suns and biting winds, but they only made his face more handsome to her. He was the anchor of their family, the sturdy oak that had shielded her from the storm and given her roots when she had been ready to blow away into nothingness. Samuel caught her looking at him across the room. The exhaustion of a long morning spent checking the winter herds melted from his features the moment their eyes met. He offered her that slow, devastatingly tender smile that was reserved entirely for her. He walked across the parlor, stepping carefully around Sarah's wooden fortress, and wrapped his large, calloused hands around Eleanor's waist. He leaned down, pressing a warm, lingering kiss to her temple. He smelled of cold leather horses and the raw, clean scent of the winter air. The herd is settled in the lower valley, Samuel murmured, his deep voice a comforting rumble against her ear. The wind is shifting, though. We might see a heavy snowfall by tomorrow night. We have enough firewood to last until spring, Eleanor replied softly, resting her hands against his broad chest. And the cellar is full. Let it snow. Samuel pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. He reached up his thumb, gently tracing the line of her cheekbone. He saw the woman she was now, strong, radiant, and utterly at peace, but I also remembered the fragile, starving widow he had found in the dark. Every time I walk through that door and see you standing here, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her, I feel like I am witnessing a miracle all over again. Eleanor leaned up, brushing her lips against his in a gentle, reassuring kiss. We are the miracle, Samuel. What we built together. This house, these children. None of it would exist if you had not knocked on my door. He held her close, wrapping her in an embrace that felt like absolute safety. As the children's laughter echoed around them, filling the spaces that had once been hollowed out by sorrow, Eleanor knew that they had conquered the past. But out on the prairie, the wind began to pitch higher, a mournful wail that signaled the approach of a darkness they had not seen in over a decade. The land was beautiful, but it was never truly tamed, and it was secretly preparing to test the strength of the home they had built. The morning of December 23rd dawned with a deceptive stillness. The golden light of the previous day had vanished, replaced by a sky the color of bruised iron. The air tasted metallic heavy with the promise of a violence that only the Montana winter could deliver. Inside the ranch house, the preparations for Christmas were in full swing, a joyful chaos that usually kept the shadows of the past at bay. Eleanor was in the kitchen, her hands dusted with white flour as she kneaded dough for the holiday loaves. The scent of yeast and warm honey filled the room, a fragrant barrier against the biting cold outside. Sarah and Clara were sitting at the large oak table, carefully stringing dried cranberries and popcorn to drape over the small pine tree Samuel had brought in from the eastern grove. It was a picture of domestic perfection, a life Eleanor had once believed was lost to her forever. But the quiet rhythm of the morning was broken by the sharp, urgent howling of the wind. It did not build slowly. It arrived all at once, slamming against the timber walls with the force of a physical blow. The thick glass of the windows rattled in their frames. The sky darkened almost instantly, turning the mid-morning into a premature, terrifying twilight. Samuel burst through the kitchen door, bringing a flurry of snow and freezing air with him. His face was tense, the relaxed demeanor of the previous day entirely gone. He stripped off his frost-covered gloves, his dark eyes scanning the room. "Where is Thomas?" Samuel asked, his voice cutting through the warmth of the kitchen like a blade. Eleanor stopped kneading the dough. She wiped her hands on her apron, a sudden inexplicable dread pooling in her stomach. "He went out after breakfast. He said he was going to the barn to help Pete with the harnesses. Why, what is wrong?" "Pete is in the bunkhouse. He hasn't seen Thomas all morning." Samuel replied, his jaw tightening. He moved to the window, peering out into the swirling white chaos. "The temperature just dropped 20 degrees in the span of an hour. It is a whiteout out there." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She rushed to the entryway, pulling a heavy shawl over her shoulders, and pushed open the front door. The wind screamed, tearing at her clothes and stealing the breath from her lungs. She could barely see the outline of the barn, just 50 yards away. The world had been swallowed by a blinding, churning ocean of snow. "Thomas!" Eleanor screamed, the sound whipped away by the gale before it could even leave the porch. "Thomas!" Samuel pulled her back inside, using his considerable strength to force the heavy oak door shut against the wind. "You cannot go out there, Eleanor. You will freeze before you reach the fence." "He is out there, Samuel." She gasped, her hands trembling violently as she grabbed the lapels of his coat. "He is 10 years old. He has your quiet determination, but he has my stubborn pride. He heard you talking about the Northern Ridge last night. He wanted to help save the stray calves. He wanted to prove he is a man." Before Samuel could answer, a loud thud echoed from the side of the house near the sheltered overhang. It was a sound that froze the blood in Eleanor's veins. It was the frantic, panicked stamping of hooves. Samuel threw the door open again. Standing there, shivering violently and covered in a thick layer of snow, was Thomas's small roan pony. The saddle was empty. The reins were dragging in the snow, torn and frayed. Eleanor collapsed against the doorframe, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The sight of the riderless horse struck her with the force of a physical blow, tearing open a wound she had spent 12 years trying to heal. Suddenly, it was not 1899. It was 1884. She was standing on the porch of a freezing, broken cabin, watching Daniel's horse return alone. She remembered the agonizing wait, the desperate prayers, and finally the terrible morning she had found her husband's broken body beside the creek, his life stolen when his horse had stumbled and thrown him against the rocks. "No," Eleanor whispered, the word tearing from her throat as a ragged sob. "No, please, God, not again. Not my boy." The grief she thought she had buried rose up like a dark tide, threatening to pull her under. She felt the phantom cold of that cruel winter of 1887, the gnawing hunger, the absolute crushing isolation of having no family and no friends close enough to care. She was suffocating under the weight of a history that was determined to repeat itself. The prairie, it seemed, was not finished taking from her. Samuel caught her before she could fall. His strong arms wrapped tightly around her trembling frame, anchoring her to the present. He looked at the empty saddle, and his face hardened into a mask of pure, unyielding resolve. The storm was screaming its victory outside, but Samuel Holden was not a man who surrendered to the dark. The wind battered the sturdy timber walls of the ranch house, screaming like a wounded animal. Eleanor stood in the entryway, her trembling hands gripping the heavy fabric of Samuel's coat. The sight of Thomas's riderless pony standing outside in the blizzard had shattered her composure, plunging her into a waking nightmare. The cold air rushing in from the crack beneath the door was nothing compared to the ice forming in her veins. Samuel did not waste a single second. He pulled Eleanor away from the freezing draft and guided her gently but firmly into the parlor, toward the radiating heat of the stone hearth. His face was a canvas of pure, unflinching determination. He was not the broken, grieving man who had wandered into her life 12 years ago. He was a father, a protector, and the bedrock of this family. "Listen to me, Eleanor," Samuel said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the howling storm outside. He took both of her shaking hands in his large, calloused ones, forcing her to look up into his deep brown eyes. "I am not going to let the prairie take our son. Do you hear me? I'm not going to let history repeat itself." Eleanor choked on a sob, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. "It is a whiteout, Samuel. You cannot see 10 feet in front of you. If you go out there, you might not come back either. I cannot lose you both. I cannot survive that again." "You will not lose me," he stated, with an absolute certainty that defied the raging blizzard. He released her hands and turned toward the heavy wooden chest near the door, throwing it open. He began pulling out the thickest winter gear they owned, wool scarves, heavy leather chaps, and his heaviest buffalo coat. "I know this land, Eleanor. I know every ridge, every valley, and every grove of trees within 20 miles. And Thomas knows it too. He's a smart boy. He will find shelter. He will hunker down and wait for me." Eleanor watched him gear up, her mind racing with a terrifying mixture of despair and awe. She saw the absolute lack of hesitation in his movements. He was preparing to walk into a frozen hell, and he was doing it without a single second of doubt. Pete, the old ranch hand, stumbled into the parlor from the back hallway, having heard the commotion. His weathered face went pale as he took in the scene. Eleanor weeping by the fire, Samuel arming himself against the winter, and the frantic, muffled whinny of the pony outside. "Boss," Pete rasped, his voice rough with age and sudden fear. "The boy. He took the pony out to the northern ridge," Samuel replied tersely, strapping a heavy leather belt around his waist. "The pony came back alone. I am going out after him." "You cannot go alone," Pete argued, hobbling forward. "I will saddle my horse. We will take a rope tie ourselves together." "No," Samuel commanded, turning to face his oldest friend. His tone left absolutely no room for negotiation. "You are too stiff for this cold, Pete. You would slow me down, and I do not have time. Thomas does not have time. I need you here. I need you to keep the fires burning. I need you to protect my wife and my daughters if the storm breaches the roof. Can you do that for me?" Pete swallowed hard, looking from Samuel's iron gaze to Eleanor's tear-streaked face. He nodded slowly. "I will keep them safe, boss. You have my word." Samuel nodded, then turned back to Eleanor. He walked over to her, his heavy boots thudding against the braided rug. He towered over her, clad in thick leather and wool, looking like a warrior preparing for a battle he fully intended to win. He reached out, taking her face in his warm, rough hands. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice softening just for her. "Look at me." She forced her eyes up to meet his. 12 years ago, I knocked on your door because I was a lost man looking for a reason to keep living." Samuel said, his words measured rhythmic and piercingly clear. "You gave me that reason. You gave me this home. You gave me Sarah and Clara and Thomas. I am not a ghost. I am your husband. And I swear to you on my life, on everything we have built together, I will bring our boy home to you." Eleanor looked into the depths of his eyes. The panic that had been suffocating her began to recede, replaced by a fierce, desperate ember of hope. She remembered the man who had sat at her table, who had repaired her broken door, who had patiently waited for her frozen heart to thaw. He had never broken a promise to her, not once. She reached up her hands, gripping his thick collar. She pulled him down and kissed him, pouring all of her fear, all of her love, and all of her strength into that single embrace. "Bring him back to me," she breathed against his lips. "Bring our son back." "I will," Samuel promised. He pulled away, grabbed his heavy rifle, and walked out the front door. The wind roared, welcoming him into the blinding white void, and the heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, leaving Eleanor standing in the sudden agonizing silence of the parlor. She did not collapse. She did not fall to the floor and weep into her hands. The Eleanor of her past might have surrendered to the despair, but that fragile woman was gone. She was Eleanor Holden now. She turned to Pete, who was watching her with a mixture of sorrow and profound respect. The tears on her face were already drying, replaced by a hardened, unyielding resolve. "Pete," she commanded, her voice ringing clear and steady in the quiet room. "Go to the kitchen and put every kettle we own on the stove. I want boiling water ready. Get the medical kit from the study. Bring down the thickest wool blankets from the cedar chest upstairs and warm them by the hearth." Pete stood a little taller, galvanized by her strength. "Yes, ma'am, right away." Eleanor walked to the window. The world outside was a swirling, impenetrable wall of white. Somewhere out there, her husband was fighting the wind, fighting the snow, and fighting time itself. She pressed her hand against the glass, ignoring the biting cold. She would not let the dark win. She would keep the fire burning. She would be the anchor that held her family to the earth, no matter how hard the storm tried to tear them away. The heavy oak door shut, sealing Samuel out in the howling white void. Eleanor stood completely still for a fraction of a second, feeling the vibration of the slamming door echo through the floorboards. The wind screamed outside, a relentless, deafening roar that tried to tear the roof from its beams. But inside the parlor, the silence left in her husband's wake was heavier than the storm. She closed her eyes, taking one deep, shuddering breath. Then she opened them. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. "Mama," a small, trembling voice called out. Eleanor turned. Clara and Sarah stood at the edge of the parlor, their faces pale and their eyes wide with terror. Sarah clutched a wooden block tightly against her chest. Clara, ever the observant older sister, had tears silently tracking down her cheeks. They had heard the commotion. They knew their brother was missing in the blizzard. Eleanor did not crumble. She crossed the room with steady, purposeful steps and knelt in front of her daughters. She pulled them both into a fierce, warm embrace, burying her face in their soft hair. She smelled the faint, sweet scent of the cinnamon apples they had been preparing just an hour ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. "Listen to me, both of you," Eleanor said, pulling back just enough to look them in the eyes. Her voice was remarkably calm, carrying a hypnotic rhythm of absolute certainty. "Your father has gone to fetch Thomas. You know your father. He is the strongest man on this prairie. He knows every inch of this land. He will find your brother, and he will bring him back to this hearth." "But the wind is so loud, Mama," Sarah whimpered, her lower lip trembling. "The wind is just noise, sweet girl," Eleanor murmured, smoothing her thumb over Sarah's tear-stained cheek. "We do not listen to the noise. We focus on what we can do. And right now, I need your help. Both of you." Clara wiped her eyes, standing a little taller. "What do you need us to do?" "I need you to be my brave girls," Eleanor instructed. "Go to the linen closet. Bring down every thick wool blanket and quilt we own. Stack them near the fire to warm. Then I need you to gather all the candles from the pantry and place them on the tables. When your father and brother come through that door, they are going to need light and they are going to need warmth. Can you do that for me?" The girls nodded, their fear momentarily eclipsed by the heavy responsibility of their tasks. They hurried off toward the stairs, their footsteps a comforting rhythm against the hardwood floor. Eleanor stood up just as Pete hobbled back into the room, his arms laden with heavy iron kettles. The weathered old cowboy named Pete, who had welcomed Eleanor without question all those years ago, moved with a desperate urgency. He set the kettles on the massive iron stove in the kitchen, stoking the fire until the flames roared like a caged beast. "The water will be boiling soon, ma'am," Pete reported, wiping soot from his deeply lined brow. "I brought the medical kit down to the table. Salves, bandages, whiskey." "Thank you, Pete," Eleanor said. She moved to the windows, inspecting the latches. The wind was forcing tiny shards of ice through the microscopic gaps in the wood. She remembered a time long ago when the freezing wind had found its way through every crack in the walls of her old broken cabin. She remembered how Samuel had repaired the broken hinge on her door and secured the windows against the wind with strips of cloth from his own spare shirt. He had protected her then. Now it was her turn to protect their sanctuary. Pete, get the canvas tarps from the mudroom and the heavy iron nails, she ordered. We're going to seal these windows tight. No drafts. We cannot afford to lose a single degree of heat. For the next hour, they worked in a synchronized, feverish rhythm. The sound of the hammer striking iron nails became a steady heartbeat within the house. Eleanor helped Pete stretch the heavy canvas over the glass, shutting out the terrifying view of the blizzard. The parlor grew darker, illuminated only by the roaring hearth and the dozens of candles the girls had meticulously arranged. Eleanor moved through the house, like a general preparing for a siege. She was no longer the desperate, lonely widow who had stood at her frosted window waiting for the end. The winter of 1887 had been the cruelest season of her life, a time when she had absolutely nothing. But she was not that fragile woman anymore. The prairie had forged her into something unbreakable. She checked the medical supplies. She checked the boiling water. She checked the blankets warming by the fire. Every physical task was a desperate prayer and anchor keeping her mind from wandering out into the lethal, freezing white void where her husband and son were fighting for their lives. When there was nothing left to prepare, the agonizing wait truly began. Eleanor sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair. By the fire, Sarah curled up in her lap, and Clara leaning heavily against her side. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to mock her, marking the slow, agonizing passage of time. Tick-tock! Every second Samuel and Thomas were out there, the cold was sinking deeper into their bones. Eleanor stared into the dancing flames, her jaw set, her eyes burning with an unshed ocean of tears. She wrapped her arms tightly around her daughters, projecting a calm she did not fully feel. She was the mother of this house. She was the keeper of the flame, and she would not let the fire die. The cold was not a temperature. It was a predator. It hunted Samuel Holden the moment he stepped off the porch and into the screaming white void. The wind tore at his heavy clothing, seeking every seam, every vulnerability. It threw jagged shards of ice against his face, stinging his eyes and freezing the moisture in his breath before it could even leave his lips. Samuel pushed forward. He did not walk. He waited. The snow drifts were already thigh-deep heavy and unyielding. Every step required a monumental effort of will. But Samuel did not stop. He could not stop. The image of Eleanor's tear-streaked face burned in his mind, a beacon hotter than any hearth fire. He had made a vow to the woman who had saved his soul 12 years ago. He would bring their son home or he would die in the snow trying. He navigated by pure instinct and the faint rolling topography beneath his heavy leather boots. He knew the path to the northern ridge blindly. He had ridden it 1,000 times in the golden light of summer and the crisp air of autumn. But the blizzard had erased the world. There were no trees, there were no fences, there was no horizon. There was only the blinding, churning white spinning in a hypnotic, disorienting vortex. Samuel roared. The wind snatched the name from his mouth, shredding the sound into nothingness. He was screaming into a void. He reached the base of the northern ridge, his chest heaving with exertion. The air here was thinner, the wind even more vicious as it crested the rocks. Samuel dropped to his knees, ignoring the agonizing bite of the cold seeping through his heavy leather chaps. He searched the ground, desperate for any sign, any broken branch or disturbed drift. But the pony's tracks had been erased hours ago. He crawled along the jagged rock face, feeling his way through the blindness. His gloved hands scraped against the frozen stone. And then he felt it. A hollowed-out alcove near the roots of a fallen cottonwood tree. A disruption in the perfect lethal blanket of white. Samuel pushed a heavy drift aside. Thomas, he breathed the word, cracking in his freezing throat. Tucked deep inside the shallow cave, half buried in the snow, was a small, shivering lump. Thomas was curled into a tight ball. His arms were wrapped fiercely around the neck of a frightened, half-frozen stray calf. The boy had lost his pony in the blinding chaos, but he had absolutely refused to abandon the helpless animal. He possessed Eleanor's fierce, stubborn, protective heart, and it had nearly cost him his life. Samuel tore off his heavy outer gloves. He reached out with trembling, freezing hands and pulled his son from the hollow. The calf scrambled deeper into the rocks, but Samuel did not care. He only cared about the boy. Thomas's face was the color of ash. His lips were a terrifying shade of blue. His eyes were closed, his eyelashes thick with solid frost. Tommy, Tommy, look at me, Samuel begged, his voice breaking. He stripped off his own heavy buffalo coat, uncaring of the lethal wind that instantly bit into his wool shirt. He wrapped the massive, still warm coat entirely around his son's rigid body. He pulled Thomas flush against his chest, trying to transfer the very beat of his own heart into the boy. Thomas groaned a tiny fractured sound. His eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that were dull and unfocused. Papa, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roaring storm. I have got you, son, Samuel choked out, burying his face in Thomas's icy hair. I told your mother I would find you. I have got you. Samuel lifted the boy into his arms. Thomas was heavy, his body dead weight in the thick layers of wool and hide. Samuel stood up, his muscles screaming in protest. He turned to face the direction of the ranch, but as he looked out into the storm, a cold, creeping horror seized his heart. The wind had shifted. It was no longer blowing from the north. It was swirling in a chaotic, multi-directional cyclone. The topography he had relied on was completely buried under new, massive drifts. The whiteout was absolute. Upward was indistinguishable from down. Samuel Holden, the veteran frontiersman, the man who knew every inch of this unforgiving territory, was entirely hopelessly disoriented. He took a step forward and then another, driven by blind, desperate adrenaline. But with every step, the terrible truth tightened its grip around his throat. He did not know which way the house was. If he walked in the wrong direction, they would wander the endless prairie until the cold stopped their hearts. He stumbled, his knee hitting the frozen earth hard. He adjusted his grip on Thomas, pulling the boy tighter against his freezing chest. The numbness was starting in his fingers and toes, a gentle, insidious lethargy that promised a painless sleep. Eleanor, Samuel whispered into the screaming wind the name of final desperate prayer. The darkness was closing in right there in the middle of the blinding white. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 4 times. The sound was a heavy, mournful tolling that was almost entirely swallowed by the deafening roar of the blizzard outside. It was late afternoon, but the sky beyond the canvas-covered windows was as black as midnight. The wind had not broken. It had only grown more enraged, a chorus of shrieking demons battering the sturdy timber walls of the ranch house. Eleanor sat rigid in the heavy wooden rocking chair. Her arms were wrapped fiercely around Clara and Sarah. The girls had finally succumbed to exhaustion, their breathing evening out as they fell into a restless sleep, lulled by the radiating heat of the massive stone hearth. But Eleanor was entirely awake. Her eyes were wide, staring unblinkingly into the dancing orange flames. Her heart was beating a frantic, unnatural rhythm against her ribs. The air in the parlor felt suddenly thin. She felt a sharp, icy dropping sensation in the pit of her stomach. It was a primal, undeniable tether pulling taut across miles of frozen prairie. She knew. She did not know how, but she knew with an absolute, terrifying certainty. Samuel was lost. The whiteout had blinded him. Her husband and her son were wandering in the dark. Eleanor gently untangled herself from her sleeping daughters. She laid them down softly on the thick wool blankets, pressing a lingering kiss to their warm foreheads. She stood up. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy stone in her chest, but it was suddenly eclipsed by a fierce, blinding maternal rage. The prairie had taken her first husband 12 years ago. It had left her starving and alone in a freezing cabin. She would burn the entire world down before she let it take Samuel and Thomas. She walked with swift, purposeful steps to the heavy oak cabinet in the hallway. She bypassed the standard oil lamps and reached for the massive brass hurricane lantern they kept for dire emergencies. It was heavy, industrial, and designed to pierce through the thickest coastal fog. She filled the glass reservoir to the very brim with kerosene. She trimmed the wick with perfectly steady hands and struck a match. The flame flared, a brilliant golden eye opening in the dim light of the hallway. But as she looked at the tightly sealed windows, a horrifying realization struck her. One lamp behind thick glass would never pierce a cyclone. If they were wandering, they needed a beacon. They needed a lighthouse. Eleanor carried the blazing lantern into the kitchen. Pete was sitting at the heavy table, his head buried in his hands, staring blankly at the boiling kettles. Pete, Eleanor said. Her voice was a sharp crack of absolute command. The old cowboy jumped scrambling to his feet. Ma'am! Get your heaviest coat, Pete, and gather every empty iron bucket we have in the mudroom. Bring the spare kerosene and the thickest rags from the workshop. Pete's eyes widened in confusion and dawning horror. Ma'am, you cannot go out there. The boss gave me strict orders. He said I was to keep you inside. He said, the boss is lost. Eleanor cut him off, her voice vibrating with a terrifying conviction that silenced the old man instantly. The wind has shifted. They are wandering in the whiteout. If we do not give them a landmark, they will freeze to death 50 yards from their own front door. We are going to build a wall of fire at the edge of the yard. Pete opened his mouth to argue, saw the unyielding iron resolve in her eyes, and simply nodded. They geared up in silence. Eleanor wrapped a thick wool scarf over her nose and mouth, pulling Samuel's spare, heavy leather coat over her own shoulders. She gripped the brass hurricane lantern in her right hand. Pete carried 2 large iron buckets, both packed tight with rags soaked in highly flammable oil. Eleanor reached for the heavy iron latch of the front door. She threw it open. The storm hit them like a physical moving wall of concrete. The cold was a living, breathing monster that instantly stole the heat from their lungs. Eleanor leaned forward, driving her shoulder into the wind, holding the lantern high. The golden light cut a pathetic 3-foot tunnel into the swirling, chaotic blizzard. She forced her way off the safety of the porch. The snow immediately swallowed her legs up to the knees. Pete followed close behind, stumbling and cursing under the awkward weight of the heavy iron buckets. They fought their way toward the perimeter fence, the absolute edge of the safe zone. Every single step was an agony of screaming muscles and burning lungs. The wind actively fought to push them back, trying to force them to surrender. Here! Eleanor screamed over the howling gale, pointing to a slight elevation near the fence line. Pete dropped the heavy buckets into the snow. He fumbled frantically with his matches, his thick leather gloves, making him dangerously clumsy. The wind kept blowing the tiny sparks away before they could catch. Eleanor threw herself to her knees in the deep snow. She wrapped her body around the iron bucket, opening her heavy leather coat to create a desperate windbreak. She was using her own body to shield the spark. Strike it now, she ordered. Pete struck the match against the dry stone in his pocket and tossed it into the bucket. The oil-soaked rags caught instantly. A massive roaring pillar of vibrant orange flame shot up into the dark swirling sky. It hissed and spat violently, battling the falling snow, but the oil burned impossibly hot. They moved 10 yards down the fence line and lit the second bucket. Eleanor stood up wedged between the 2 blazing iron buckets. The heat of the roaring fires licked at her back, threatening to singe her coat while the freezing wind actively tore at her exposed face. She raised the brass hurricane lantern high above her head, her arm locking into place. She was a lighthouse in a sea of frozen despair. She stared into the absolute terrifying darkness of the prairie, projecting every ounce of her unbreakable will, every shred of her profound love out into the howling void. Look for me, her heart screamed into the storm, a silent, desperate plea echoing across the ice. I am here. I am waiting for you. Follow the light. Come home. The darkness was not just in the sky. It was seeping into Samuel's mind. The agonizing burn in his muscles had slowly faded, replaced by a terrifying, insidious numbness. His legs moved mechanically, dragging through snowdrifts that felt as heavy as wet cement. He clutched Thomas tightly against his chest, but the boy's unnatural stillness sent waves of pure panic crashing against Samuel's failing resolve. Thomas was so cold. His breathing was frighteningly shallow, barely a whisper against Samuel's frozen collar. The heavy buffalo coat was not enough to fight a blizzard of this magnitude. Samuel stumbled, his heavy leather boot catching on a hidden rock beneath the ice. He fell hard, twisting his body midair to ensure he took the brunt of the impact, protecting the fragile life in his arms. The frozen earth knocked the air from his lungs in a violent rush. He lay there in the deep snow, the wind screaming in his ears, actively burying them both beneath a heavy, suffocating white blanket. Just rest, a deceptive whispering voice echoed in his mind. Just close your eyes for 1 minute. The pain will stop. It was the siren song of the freezing prairie. He had heard tales of men who simply laid down in the snow and went to sleep, their bodies giving up the fight against the overwhelming cold. He felt the seductive pull of that dark, peaceful sleep. It would be so easy to stop fighting. But then an image flashed behind his frost-coated eyelids. Eleanor. Not the fragile, starving widow he had found 12 years ago, but the fierce, radiant woman she was this very morning. He remembered her hands gripping his collar. He remembered the desperate, absolute faith in her voice when she told him to bring their son home. He had promised her. He had sworn on his life. If he closed his eyes now, he would be the storm that broke her. He would be the reason the light in her eyes died forever. He would become the very ghost he had promised never to be. Samuel let out a guttural primal roar that was instantly swallowed by the gale. He forced his frozen, uncooperative limbs to move. He pushed himself up onto his knees, the snow dragging at his heavy clothes like skeletal hands. He heaved Thomas back against his chest, locking his deadened arms around his son. He staggered to his feet. He would not die here. He would not let the prairie win. He took one step, then another. He was entirely blind, navigating a chaotic ocean of white. He kept his head down, shielding his face from the jagged ice crystals flying on the wind. And then he saw it. It was a tiny, impossible flicker, a faint, dancing speck of vibrant orange in a universe of endless gray and white. Samuel froze, his heart hammering a frantic, agonizing rhythm against his ribs. Was it a hallucination? The final cruel trick of a dying brain? He blinked rapidly, forcing the frozen lashes apart. The light did not vanish. It flickered, hissed, and flared brighter, and beside it another point of light, and between them a steady, piercing golden glow. It was not a hallucination. It was fire. It was oil burning against the storm. It was a beacon. A massive surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded Samuel's veins. It burned away the lethargy. It shattered the numbness. The light was a tether, a physical lifeline thrown across the frozen void. He locked his eyes onto that golden glow and moved. He did not feel the agonizing cold. He did not feel the crushing weight of the snow. He only felt the magnetic, undeniable pull of that light. As he drew closer, the chaotic shapes of the blizzard began to resolve. The roaring of the wind was suddenly joined by the aggressive hiss of burning oil. He saw the two heavy iron buckets' flames leaping wildly into the air. And standing exactly between them, an unyielding pillar of strength against the screaming gale, was Eleanor. She was holding the heavy brass hurricane lantern high above her head. Her face was wrapped in thick wool, her eyes narrowed against the biting wind, completely fearless. Her arm was locked tight, refusing to lower the heavy brass even an inch. She was a lighthouse. She was his home. Eleanor! Samuel screamed, his voice tearing from his raw throat. She saw him. The lantern lowered slightly as she surged forward, abandoning the safety of the firelight. She waded into the deep snow, fighting the wind with every ounce of her strength. They collided in the dark, a desperate, frantic tangle of heavy coats and freezing limbs. Eleanor threw her arms around Samuel's neck, her hands frantically seeking the bundle against his chest. "I have him," Samuel choked out, his voice cracking with exhaustion and overwhelming relief. "He is alive, Eleanor. I have him." Eleanor let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, a pure release of agonizing terror. She pressed her face against his icy cheek, then reached down to touch the thick wool wrapping her son. Pete materialized from the swirling snow beside them, his weathered face breaking into a look of absolute awe. He grabbed Samuel's arm, helping support the massive weight of the unconscious boy. "Inside," Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "Get them inside now." They turned their backs on the raging, defeated storm. Guided by the blazing iron buckets and the golden lantern, they stumbled toward the heavy oak door of the ranch house. The prairie had tried to claim them, but it had failed. They crossed the threshold, the heavy door slamming shut behind them, sealing the lethal winter out and locking the warmth and the family safely within. The heavy oak door slammed shut instantly, cutting off the deafening shriek of the blizzard. The sudden silence in the entryway was heavy, broken only by the ragged, desperate panting of Samuel and Pete. The immense heat of the house hit them like a physical wave. Ice instantly began to melt from Samuel's buffalo coat, dripping onto the braided rug in dark, heavy tears. Get him to the hearth, Eleanor commanded. She dropped the brass lantern, uncaring as it clattered against the floorboards, and rushed ahead of them into the parlor. Samuel carried Thomas to the massive stone fireplace. He collapsed to his knees, his own superhuman strength finally giving out, and laid the boy gently on the thickest wool rug. Thomas was terrifyingly still. His lips were a bruised, translucent blue, and his skin was as cold and pale as the snow that had nearly claimed him. Tommy, Clara whimpered from the corner, holding Sarah back as their mother had strictly instructed. Stay back, girls. Give us room. Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the absolute terror gripping her heart. She dropped to the floor beside her son. Pete, the blanket, Samuel, let me get those frozen clothes off him. Samuel's hand shook violently, his fingers stiff and clumsy from the severe frost. Eleanor pushed his hands away gently. I have him, Samuel. Pete helped Samuel with his coat. Get him by the fire. Eleanor worked with frantic surgical precision. She stripped away the heavy ice-caked wool and leather that encased her son. Beneath the layers, Thomas was shivering so violently his teeth chattered in a terrifying staccato. It was a good sign. It meant his core was still fighting. She took the heavy quilts Pete had warmed by the fire and wrapped them tightly around Thomas, creating a thick cocoon of radiating heat. Pete the whiskey from the medical kit, she ordered. Pete handed her the small glass bottle. She rubbed a few drops against Thomas's pale gums. The sharp alcohol made the boy cough a weak, sputtering sound, but it forced him to draw a deeper, vital breath. She grabbed a clean linen cloth, dipped it into a basin of lukewarm water, knowing that hot water would severely damage the frozen tissue, and began to gently press it against his icy cheeks and blue lips. Come back to me, Thomas, she whispered, her face inches from his. You are safe. You are home. The storm cannot touch you here. She rubbed his small, rigid hands between her own. As the warmth slowly began to seep into his frozen limbs, Thomas whimpered. The thaw was an agonizing process. The returning blood felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing the skin. But the pain meant he was alive. It meant the tissue was saved. Beside her, Samuel sat slumped heavily against the stone hearth. Pete had managed to strip away the frozen outerwear and was wrapping a heavy quilt over Samuel's trembling shoulders. Samuel's eyes were locked entirely on his son, wide with an agonizing mixture of residual fear and profound guilt. He would not leave the stray calf. Samuel rasped, his voice a broken, hollow whisper. He dug a hollow in the rocks. He tried to save it. He is just like you, Eleanor. Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting her husband's. She saw the profound exhaustion etched into every deep line of his weathered face. She saw the dangerous frostbite darkening the edges of his ears and the high crest of his cheekbones. He had walked willingly into a frozen hell for their family. He is like both of us, Eleanor replied fiercely. She handed the lukewarm cloth to Pete. Keep pressing this to his face, Pete, gently, and give him a few drops of the warm broth if he wakes. She moved a short distance to her husband. She knelt before Samuel, taking his large, violently trembling hands in hers. They were ice cold, the skin a raw, angry red. She lifted them to her lips, pressing her warm breath against his freezing knuckles. You kept your promise? She murmured, the tears finally breaking free and spilling down her cheeks. You brought him back to me. I almost lost the way. Samuel confessed, the weight of the near tragedy crushing his voice. The wind shifted. I was blind in the whiteout. I was ready to give up Ellie, and then I saw your fire. You guided us home. I will always leave a light for you, she promised, resting her forehead against his chest. For the next 3 hours, the parlor became a sanctuary of desperate, focused healing. The wind continued to rage outside a defeated monster, scratching futilely at the thick glass, but inside the temperature slowly rose. Eleanor moved seamlessly between her husband and her son. She massaged Samuel's stinging hands with a thick herbal salve, her touch as gentle as a falling leaf. She forced them both to sip the rich beef broth, replacing the cooled blankets with freshly heated ones from the hearth. Slowly, miraculously, the terrifying blue tint faded from Thomas's lips, replaced by a faint, healthy pink. His violent shivering subsided into a deep, exhausted sleep. The harsh, ragged sound of his breathing smoothed out, becoming a steady, rhythmic hum that filled the quiet room. Eleanor sat back on her heels, wiping a mixture of sweat and tears from her face. She looked at her son, breathing easily in his warm cocoon. She looked at her husband, whose eyes were drooping with absolute exhaustion, but who was undeniably alive. The frantic, desperate fight was over. They had snatched life back from the jaws of the prairie. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the midnight hour, a deep, resonant sound that officially welcomed Christmas Day. Outside, the blizzard continued its furious assault against the heavy timber walls, but its screams seemed to have lost its terrifying power. Inside the parlor, the only sounds were the crackling of the thick oak logs in the hearth and the soft, rhythmic breathing of their sleeping family. Pete had finally succumbed to his exhaustion. The weathered old cowboy was snoring softly from a heavy armchair in the corner, a thick wool blanket pulled right up to his chin. Sarah and Clara were curled together on the overstuffed sofa, completely lost in the deep, innocent sleep of childhood. And Thomas, the brave boy who had challenged the prairie and survived, lay on the thick rug near the fire. His chest was rising and falling in a steady, beautiful cadence. His color was completely normal now. The agonizing danger had finally passed. Eleanor sat on the floor next to Samuel. They leaned heavily against the sturdy stone base of the fireplace, sharing the radiating heat. Samuel had his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, holding her firmly against his side. She rested her head on his chest, closing her eyes to listen to the strong, steady thud of his heart beneath the layers of warm wool. "It is midnight," Eleanor whispered into the quiet room. "Merry Christmas, Samuel." Samuel tightened his hold on her. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, his breathing slow and incredibly deep. "Merry Christmas, Ellie. When I was out there in the whiteout, I did not think I would live to see this one." "Do not say that," she murmured, her hand resting flat over his heart. "You promised me you were not a ghost. You kept your word." He was quiet for a long moment. The firelight danced across his weathered features, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. He turned his head slightly, looking at the heavy oak door that had been sealed, tight against the storm. 12 years ago tonight," Samuel said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her. "I was a man riding through a storm just like this one. I was cold, I was tired, I was entirely empty. And then I saw your cabin." Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. She remembered the sheer terror and the desperate loneliness of that night. She remembered the sudden, shocking sound of his knock at her door that came so unexpectedly she nearly cried out. February chapter 10, The Radiant Dawn and Epilogue. Target word, count 850 words. The morning of Christmas Day arrived not with a whisper, but with a blinding, triumphant brilliance. The wind, which had screamed like a wounded beast for 2 days and 2 nights, was finally dead. In its place was a silence so profound, so absolute that it felt like a physical weight lifting from the heavy timber roof of the ranch house. Eleanor awoke to the sight of golden sunlight piercing through the tiny gaps in the heavy canvas they had nailed over the windows. The narrow beams of light danced across the braided rug, a warm golden promise that the world had not ended in the dark. She stirred, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of Samuel's arm draped over her waist. They were still sitting on the floor by the stone hearth, the embers reduced to a soft, glowing crimson. She carefully slipped out from under his embrace, her joints stiff, but her heart lighter than it had been in days. She walked to the nearest window and gently pried the canvas back. The sight took her breath away. The Montana prairie was completely transformed. The violent, chaotic ocean of the blizzard had settled into a pristine, rolling landscape of pure, glittering diamonds. The sky was an endless, aching blue, entirely devoid of clouds. And out by the perimeter fence, buried up to their rims in massive snowdrifts, were the 2 iron buckets. They were cold now, covered in a fresh layer of white, but they stood as silent monuments to the terrifying battle that had been fought and won. The rest of the house began to stir. Clara and Sarah woke on the sofa, blinking sleepily at the sunlight filtering into the parlor. And then a quiet rustle came from the thick quilts near the fire. Thomas sat up. He looked small, his face still a little pale, but he offered his mother a weak, incredibly beautiful smile. "Merry Christmas, Mama," Thomas whispered. Tears of pure, unadulterated joy sprang to Eleanor's eyes. She rushed forward, pulling her son into a fierce, gentle embrace. "Merry Christmas, my brave boy." Samuel woke slowly, rubbing a hand over his silver-streaked hair. He looked exhausted, the skin on his face tight and pale. But as he looked at his wife holding his son, his deep brown eyes were clear and bright. The morning passed in a blur of quiet, healing miracles. Pete, moving a little slower than usual, managed to brew a massive pot of strong coffee and heat the cinnamon apples that had been abandoned the day before. They sat around the heavy oak dining table, not speaking much, simply absorbing the profound miracle of each other's presence. The food tasted sweeter than anything Eleanor had ever known. The laughter of her daughters, the steady warmth of her husband's hand resting over hers, the bright living eyes of her son. It was the greatest Christmas gift she could have ever received. They had survived. They had faced the absolute worst the frontier had to offer, and their love had proven stronger than the storm. Many decades later, the ranch house would still stand, its timber walls weathered by countless winters. The prairie would remain untamed, vast, and wildly beautiful. But the home inside would be completely invincible. Eleanor Holden, her hair entirely white, her hands lined with the proud map of a life well lived, would sit by that very same stone hearth. She would be surrounded by a dozen grandchildren, their wide, innocent eyes reflecting the warm firelight. She would tell them the story of the winter of 1887, when she was a lonely widow who had given up all hope until a stranger with kind brown eyes knocked on her door. And then she would tell them the story of the great blizzard of 1899. He walked into the blinding white to save your father. Eleanor would say, her voice carrying the hypnotic rhythmic cadence of a master storyteller. And I stood at the edge of the world with a lantern and a fire pulling them back from the dark. Because that is what true love is, my darlings. It is not just the easy days and the warm sunshine. It is the choice to be the light for someone else when the storm is trying to blind them. She would look across the parlor, meeting the eyes of her husband. Samuel would be older, his movements slower, but his gaze would still hold that same profound, devastating respect. They would share a secret knowing smile, the kind of smile that is only earned by walking through the fire and the ice hand in hand. The storms would always come, but as long as they had each other, they would never ever be lost in the dark. Thank you for listening to this Midnight Verdict story. When the cold storms of life hit, who is the beacon of light that guides you safely home? Or perhaps whose lighthouse are you? Share your own stories of love, survival, and family in the comments below. If this tale warmed your heart, please subscribe and join us for our next journey. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.